Each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to be patient a little longer until the roll was completed of their fellow servants and brothers who were still to be killed as they had been. If we stop and think about the scripture, it is saying, wait a little longer until the roll has been finished. The program hasn't been quite carried out yet. I have to kill a few more people. What could this mean? Does it mean that God is subservient to a predetermined program? We find a similar passage in one of the apocryphal Jewish apocalypse, usually called 4 Ezra. In the 4th chapter of that work, we are told that the chambered souls of the dead waiting for their salvation, ask God, how long are we to remain here? They are getting impatient, just as the souls in Revelation are getting impatient. And the archangel's response is, when the number of those like yourselves is completed, for God has weighed the age in the balance and measured the times by measure, and numbered the times by number, and he will not move or rouse them until the mission is fulfilled. In other words, there is a pre-existing pattern in existence that God seems obliged to follow. This corresponds to a remark of Jung in answer to Job. He had been discussing Yahweh's considering the possibility of incarnating, yet nothing can happen without a pre-existing pattern. The comment reveals to what an extent Jung considers the archetypes, the ancient pre-existing patterns of the psyche, to be determinate. God himself can operate only through the patterns that are already laid down, an application of our passage in Revelation. The pattern requires that certain things to be done first, that there be some more killings. The question of vengeance comes up here, in the motive of the revenge of the souls of those waiting under the divine altar, and revenge even in the divine mind. It is something that Virgil brings up on the first page of the Aeneid. Can resentment so fierce dwell in heavenly breasts? There is, at any rate, no doubt that Yahweh is an avenging God. And I bring this up for reflection because vengeance is so rampant in the psychology of the world today. Terrorist organizations of all kinds and the cycles of revenge that go on call out desperately for some psychological understanding of what is happening. The issue is broached here in Revelation, but is not without biblical antecedents. Let me demonstrate. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 40 through 42. Yes, I, Yahweh, raise my hand to heaven, and I say, as surely as I live forever, when I have whetted my flashing sword, I shall enforce justice. I shall return vengeance to my foes. I shall take vengeance on my foes. I shall make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword will feed on flesh, the blood of the wounded and the prisoners, the disheveled heads of the enemy. Jeremiah chapter 46, verse 10. For this is the day of the Lord, Yahweh, Sabaoth, the day of vengeance, when he takes revenge on his foes. The sword will devour until gorged, until drunk with their blood. For Lord Yahweh is holding a sacrificial feast in the land of the north, on the river Euphrates. Nahum chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. Yahweh is a jealous and vengeful God. Yahweh takes vengeance. He is rich in wrath. Yahweh takes vengeance on his foes. He stores up fury for his enemies. Yahweh is slow to anger, but great in power. Yahweh never lets evil go unpunished. In storm and whirlwind he takes his way. The clouds are the dust stirred by his feet. The mountains tremble before him. The hills reel. The earth collapses before him. The world and all who live in it. His fury. Who can withstand it? Who can endure his burning wrath? His anger pours out like fire, and the rocks break apart before him. As I suggested at the beginning of this study, we can see from these Old Testament references that the book of Revelation is largely Jewish, with just a superficial Christian overlay. The vengeful deity is a far cry from the accepted doctrine of Christ in the Gospels. Indeed, as Jung explains in Answer to Job, the first advent of Christ was meant to transform Yahweh, but the second advent, with which the book of Revelation is concerned, clearly brings up the untransformed God image. Here is what Jung says on this issue. He is writing about the sixth seal, which we have yet to consider. The sixth seal brings a cosmic catastrophe, and everything hides from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come. We no longer recognize the meek Lamb who lets himself be led unresistingly to the slaughter. There is only the aggressive and irascible ram whose rage can at last be vented. In all this I see less a metaphysical mystery than the outburst of long pent-up negative feelings such as can frequently be observed in people who strive for perfection. Here, Jung is explaining the imagery as having something to do with the personal psychology of John, but then he expands upon the notion. Let us be psychologically correct, however. It is not the conscious mind of John that thinks up these fantasies. They come to him in a violent revelation. They fall upon him involuntarily with an unexpected vehemence. I have seen many compensating dreams of believing Christians who deceive themselves about their real psychic constitution and imagined that they were in a different condition from what they were in reality. But I have seen nothing that even remotely resembles the brutal impact with which the opposites collide in John's visions. The purpose of the apocalyptic visions is not to tell John, as an ordinary human being, how much shadow he hides beneath his luminous nature, but to open the seer's eye to the immensity of God, for he who loves God will know God. We can say that just because John loved God and did his best to love his fellows also, this gnosis, this knowledge of God, struck him, like Job. The point is that conscious Christianity constructs a layer, I wouldn't say a veneer, so as to address the dubious aspects of it, over the individual psyche, wherein the primordial Yahwistic libido has undergone a certain amount of transformation through education, experience, and the application of certain symbolic images consciously applied. However, break that veneer, scratch below it, and the primordial psyche is just as described in the passages we have read. Vengeance is a very prominent dynamism in the operation of the unconscious driving from the untransformed self. It is a grave problem for humanity, not to be glossed over by ineffectual preaching on Christian humility. Rather, as Jung states, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is what has the transformative effect. The darkness does not vanish, but is mediated by a consciousness that knows its true nature. Let me remind the reader that these texts from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament give us a view of the facts of the objective psyche. They are not metaphysical facts, but psychic facts, and it does no good to fuss about whether they should or should not be a certain way. That is the way they are. Everyone who goes within deeply enough will discover these same facts, because they are a part of the collective psyche. We are all grounded in that same foundation. Stars falling from heaven. Although I cannot go into every aspect of symbolism in the book of Revelation, I wish to call particular attention to the imagery of stars falling from heaven when the sixth seal is broken. In my vision, when he broke the sixth seal, there was a violent earthquake, and the sun went as black as coarse sackcloth. The moon turned red as blood all over, and the stars of the sky fell onto the earth like figs dropping from a fig tree when high wind shakes it. The sky disappeared like a scroll rolling up, and all the mountains and islands were shaken from their places. Then all the kings of the earth, the governors and the commanders, the rich people and the men of influence, the whole population, its slaves and citizens, hid in caverns and among the rocks of the mountains. They said to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us away from the one who sits on the throne and from the retribution of the Lamb. For the great day of his retribution has come, and who can face it? Stars falling from heaven is an image of the upper or spiritual aspect of the collective unconscious erupting into consciousness. The stars would signify archetypal entities that fall down to earth. In other words, they fall into the ego. Thus, we have here an invasion of consciousness by the collective unconscious, which, as we have seen, is one of the features of the coming of the self. In the creation of consciousness, I have recorded a very impressive dream in this regard, which we will take up below in greater detail. But at the beginning of it, the dreamer is standing on the Palisades on the opposite side of the Hudson River from New York City, watching as Manhattan is invaded by giant aliens from outer space, and fireballs were in the sky, heading for the Earth. That is a variation of the theme of stars falling from heaven. And I recorded another relevant dream in Anatomy of the Psyche, in which a woman describes a piece of the moon falling down to Earth into her apartment. These are examples of how this basic image can express itself in the process of analysis, but the image is also very common in the phenomenology of psychosis, when the collective unconscious bursts wide open and inundates the ego with transpersonal images that the ego cannot handle. As our study proceeds, we will see that this invasion by the unconscious happens from two directions simultaneously: an invasion from above, but also an invasion from below. Both sets of images are directly applicable to what occurs psychologically when the unconscious starts to open up. Marked on the forehead. Now, let us consider at greater length the image of being marked. It comes up in Revelation chapter 7. Next, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the world to keep them from blowing over the land or the sea or any tree. Then I saw another angel rising where the sun rises, carrying the seal of the living God. He called in a powerful voice to the 4 angels, whose duty was to devastate land and sea. Wait before you do any damage on land or at sea or to the trees, until we have put the seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. And I heard how many had been sealed: 144,000 out of all the tribes of Israel. The scripture explains that the number 144,000 was reached by marking 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, an allusion to the archetype of 12. Here is a close parallel from Ezekiel as the divine vengeance is about to attack Jerusalem. Immediately, 6 men advanced from the upper north gate, each holding a deadly weapon. Among them was a man dressed in linen, with a scribe's inkhorn in his belt. They came in and halted in front of the bronze altar. The glory of the God of Israel rose from above the winged creature where it had been, towards the threshold of the temple. He called to the man dressed in linen with a scribe's inkhorn in his belt, and Yahweh said to him, "Go all through the city, all through Jerusalem, and mark a cross on the foreheads of all who grieve, and lament over all the loathsome practices in it." I heard him say to the others, "Follow him through the city and strike. Not one glance of pity. Show no mercy. Old men, young men, girls, children, women, kill and exterminate them all. But do not touch anyone with a cross on his forehead." This is the same idea of marking or sealing for the purpose of protection from divine vengeance. I should mention, however, that the translation of Hebrew "ta" as cross in this portion of Ezekiel is not followed universally. The New Revised Standard Edition, for example, translates simply, "put a mark on their foreheads." It may be that the Roman Catholic background of the New Jerusalem Bible version has influenced a translation with a Christian allusion. There is, however, some possibility that the early script for "ta" was